and we are live on YouTube.
Hello everybody, welcome. My name's Phil Alexander. I'm talking to you from Edinburgh. We have a very international session as always. Maybe before we start, it's just worth acknowledging our thoughts and our prayers with friends and colleagues in Ukraine at the moment. I'm sure we're all thinking very much about that situation. However, we are going somewhere else today. We're going to Morocco, courtesy of Sam Torjman Thomas, and we're very grateful to Gordon Dale of the Jewish Music Forum, who has made available a talk that Sam gave a couple of weeks ago. I'll just very quickly explain the chronology of what's happening today. Gordon is going to introduce the recording of the talk that Sam gave. So he's going to introduce himself, introducing Sam. And then following that recording, Vanessa, Paloma, Elbaz is going to join us to give a response to Sam's talk. And then following Vanessa's response, Sam himself will join us for some Q&A. So we have a nice, rich, diverse range of voices today. Thanks for coming. I'm going to hand over to Gordon now.
Thank you, Phil. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, to see you. As Phil mentions, the talk that we're about to watch was given on February 7th, Monday, February 7th, as part of the Jewish Music Forum's season. This is the Jewish Music Forum based in New York. It's a project of the American Society for Jewish Music. I'm very grateful to the Conversations on Zoom platform for giving an opportunity to rebroadcast the talk, because this way we have an opportunity for anyone who was unable to be there to watch the talk again, and for Samuel Torjman Thomas to answer some questions from this group. The program that took place on the 7th was a wonderful talk that was followed by rich conversation from the audience members. If I understand properly, the plan for today will be to watch Dr. Thomas's talk, and after that, before we watch I should say it this way, the recording will be paused at the end of his presentation, and rather than watching the Q&A session from there, we'll have an opportunity to hear a response and to take questions from this group. If anybody has any questions or would like to learn more about the Jewish Music Forum's activities, you're very welcome to reach out to me. You can send me a chat message on here, or you can email me directly at gdale@huc.edu. So anyway, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Phil, to Geraldine, to Mark Kligman, to Lori, to everyone who works on this program for the opportunity to rebroadcast the tape. And I look forward to watching it a second time now, so that I get to catch the things I missed the first time around. So without further ado, I think we can roll the tape. Dr. Samuel Torjman Thomas teaches ethnomusicology and Sephardic Jewish studies at City University of New York, and is a faculty member for both the Aleph and Academy of Jewish Religion cantorial programs. His scholarship centers on Sephardic thought and culture, musical cultures of the Middle East and North Africa, Jewish music traditions, and jazz-based music traditions. Dr. Torjman Thomas is also Director of Musical Arts at Brooklyn Sephardic Community Center. He is a multi-instrumentalist on saxophone, oud, and ney. He's a vocalist performing in Hebrew, Arabic, and Spanish, and founder of the Asefa and New York Andalus ensembles. His artistic work centers on performing musics of North Africa, the Middle East, and global jazz. He's a frequent guest speaker, chazan, and facilitator in ecumenical spaces, cultural institutions, and music and spiritual retreats worldwide. Sam, it's really a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Welcome to my humble abode in the heart of Brooklyn. And it's a pleasure to be invited to present here some of my work on the Moroccan Jewish community. This actually dates back sometime, work that I've been working on for years, having had the opportunity to work with my esteemed professors at CUNY, Professor Stephen Blum and Jane Sugarman, and so many other advisors and folks along the way, like Mark Slobin and Mark Kligman and all the greats in our field. So it's really a pleasure to share some of this work. I have grown a few gray hairs over these years as well, which comes along with the territory. So this is what I call performing the homeland, contesting the boundaries of Moroccan Jewish identity. I'm going to just immediately share here a presentation that I've put together. And let's make sure I bring us back up front here. So Moroccan Jews in Brooklyn has really kind of been my focus, and trying to extrapolate from there some ideas about what's happening in contemporary Jewish experience, and particularly revolving around the idea of ethnicization, how the community is contesting boundaries, navigating a modern Jewish experience in terms of dealing with identity construction and diaspora ideas, which of course animate lots of Jewish history. So the community is situated around Gravesend, Brooklyn, which is where a number of Sephardi Mizrahi or North African, Middle Eastern communities inhabit for many generations now. And the community includes quite predominantly Syrian Jews here in New York, from Aleppo, kind of forming the nucleus of the community, to later immigration of Jews from Damascus. Also Egyptian, Lebanese, Kurdish, Turkish, and beyond. More recently, lots of immigrants coming from Israel itself, having some kind of Sephardi Mizrahi type background, which we generally, a more widespread appellation is the term Yerushalmi Sephardim. And more recently, also immigrants from France, forming some part of the community. So in the Moroccan community itself, in Hebrew, Marokkaim, so you can see in my slide sometimes Moroccan, some Jews, or sometimes Marokkaim, which is just, clearly defining that, I'm suggesting there's a number of pan-Sephardic synagogues here in the community, but sub-ethnic associations as well that are limited to expressions of personal identity, and certain synagogues that really want to focus on that Jewish sub-ethnic identity, if you will, that goes a little bit more hyper-specific than from Jewish ethnicity more broadly. And so in this community, what makes up the Moroccan Jewish community is first-generation immigrants from Morocco, mostly in the 60s and 70s and 80s, with direct association still to Morocco. Many folks going back and forth somewhat regularly to Morocco, having families still in Morocco. Immigrants from Israel and from France, and then second generation and beyond, born here in Brooklyn, and intersecting with all of the other Jewish ways here in a very robust and rich tapestry of Jewish life that we call Flatbush. So I'm looking at many members associating from afar and residing also in the other neighborhoods and boroughs and beyond, and these individuals participating in communal activities on a regular basis, but being hindered from participating in Shabbat and holidays in other places because of observant lifestyle, which really centers around geographically the neighborhood. So an array of friends and informants over the years, from the leadership, Rabbi Gad Buskila, who is the rabbi of one of the most predominant Moroccan synagogues in the neighborhood, Netivot Yisrael, Rav Michael Kakon, who's a Chazan, which and Rav Chaim Dahan, a good friend of mine who unfortunately passed in the early days of the pandemic. So it's really special to get an opportunity to review some of his work. And an array of other folks in the community. I myself have really embedded myself in the community and gotten to know the community from the inside out, and really focused on how this one synagogue community is engaging with the greater neighborhood. So to orient our focus for a bit, for Moroccan Jews in one synagogue community, liturgical expression, and that's what I like to focus on a bit tonight, liturgical and para-liturgical, memorializes a homeland and contests the boundaries of a distinctive Jewish ethnic identity. So if we take the notion that diaspora, which has been packed and unpacked in so many different ways by some great literature in the last couple decades, but if we take certain things as core tenets of diaspora, what I take at least is the notion of a homeland orientation and the reproduction of such. And that can mean often a disassociation from the homeland because of schism or some sort of great occurrence, not able to keep connection to the homeland. But in this day and age, it can also mean a lot of connection to the homeland, because we do have more robust ways of doing that and sustaining those ties to a homeland. But nevertheless, a homeland of sorts seems to be a very important part of the diasporic imagination. I also add, very importantly, that a diaspora is a constellation, and it means a constellation of communities that are indeed engaging with one another over a great transnational expanse, and how that is being done and fostered through, of course, in our case, music and musical expression. So these definitely are two telltale elements that I think most would agree are part of diaspora. So what I'm looking at here, or bringing forth tonight, is a focus on ritual, on soundscape, and on aesthetics. So I'll read that ritual, soundscape, and aesthetics taken together memorialize and define a Jewish ethnic identity in ways that encourage community members to reinforce a communal identity, which is conceived as diasporic inherently. In the case of the Moroccan Jews, I also am finding that we're seeing actually a multi-layered diasporic identity coming forth in the expressions of the community. And this is where we get to the contesting of boundaries. It's not just contesting of boundaries between Moroccans and Egyptians, or Ashkenazi communities or Hasidic communities here in New York, but rather going a little bit further than that in really contesting boundaries that bring forth a multi-layered diasporic identity, one which I think of as really defined around the historical experience of the Jewish diaspora, that being, the 2,000-year diaspora, the Sephardi diaspora, which is really centered around the expulsion from 1492, but clearly begins in the mind of many prior to that. And then the Moroccan diaspora, which is now something really a product of the 20th century, which really we see an incredible realignment of Jewish life in the world during this period. So these three layers intersect with one another, overlap with one another, but are also characteristically distinct at times. So I write that, as Torino suggests in Music as Social Life, the freedom or freedom space, and I may add the notion of freedom time, as music is an expression in time, produced by the concentrated context of ritualized performance, encourages a social experience whereby community members are actively joining up and demanding a level of heightened group consciousness. Now, this ritualized performance space as a social experience is encouraged by the very nature of the observant Jewish community, living close to the synagogue, coming together in this particular communal space, and on top of that, really disassociating during that time from many of the things that we have come to know so well from our modern human experience. The cell phones and things like that that are not really part of that scene. They are literally kept out of the scene. So it kind of creates a concentrated space, if you will. The nature of the soundscape, defined by a cappella performance for the most part, because of course Jewish performance in these spaces does not include musical instruments in the liturgical expression, does in certain para-liturgical contexts, but not so much in the liturgical. So we really have a soundscape defined by a cappella performance. The physical space itself, the acoustics, the setup of the actors, if you will, in the community space, as well as the micro expressions surrounding the sanctioned liturgical material. That is, side comments or riffs or things like that that individuals get into and put out into the soundscape, into the sound sphere, creates a scene, an important backdrop. This layered diaspora consciousness that I mentioned before, this multi-layered diaspora identity, which I think is a consciousness ultimately, is expressed precisely because musical expression within the context of liturgical practice successfully transmits emblems of identity, which are reproduced intergenerationally through icons and indices, if you will, embedded within aesthetic considerations. So I'm going to look a bit more deeply at the aesthetics. So we're talking about the ritual space in the context of ritual. We're talking about the soundscape, what it actually sounds like in that space. And we'll talk about the aesthetics themselves as kind of the place where the icons and indices of communal identity, or in the case of a layered diaspora consciousness, multi kinds of communal identities are embedded in that aesthetic expression. So I write here that I insist on, that quoting Schaeffer, I insist on making a change of perspective about aesthetics themselves that moves us from the domain of objects to an approach in terms of rich signals, that refrains from implying universalism or relativism as principles for regarding the relations between the role of aesthetics and different types of rich signals. So let me continue on down. So to frame the diaspora and ethnicization, as I was saying before about what is exactly diaspora and participation in this migratory dispersal from a homeland and a persistent ethnic identification through boundary maintenance and sustenance of a transnational network of co-ethnics are all features of the Jewish community's experience with migration and settlement during the past 2 millennia. But maintenance of these boundaries is a field of contestation because these boundaries are not hard and fast and locked in and immovable. They are responding to the moment that we're living in. And so I think as an ethnomusicologist and as a member of the community itself, I'm interested in how that response, how that contestation is happening in the moment. You know, it's a different sort of thing than looking just at a historical, from a historical perspective. So I'm going to use the term ethnicization here to refer specifically to the process of formulating, negotiating, and ultimately maintaining boundaries. So the layered diaspora consciousness, as I said before, is really these kind of Jewish, Sephardic, and Moroccan diaspora layers coming together. And I think that we're becoming more comfortable with the fact that within discussions about Jewish identity and studies of Jewish identity, that there isn't just one kind of Jew. And that is part of the experience of the Jewish diaspora in and of itself, but also that there are these Jewish experiences within the Jewish experience within the Jewish experience. So to drill down a little bit more on the ritual, soundscape, and aesthetics, and how they're forming this layered diaspora consciousness, which ultimately is informing and defining this contemporary Moroccan Jewish ethnic identity. I'm going to look at ritual from primarily the liturgy, Shabbat liturgy, liturgy of Kriyat Torah, or things associated with the recitation of Torah, and Tisha B'Av Kinot, which are a category of pieces, piyutim, that are specifically performed on the commemoration day of Tisha B'Av in the summertime, and Yamim Noraim, which are the days of awe, the high holy days, and the liturgy related to that. And furthermore, rituality itself, as I was saying before, just the experience of being in that space in a certain way and participating in a certain way that is actually removed from much of the contemporary experiences with electronics, and also, of course, with instruments and things like that. The soundscape, the sonic framework, a cappella, mentioned before, also language, performance in Hebrew, at times in Arabic, at times elements in Ladino, but the space, it's the soundscape, including these multi languages. You hear French, you hear and English, of course, but in terms of the actual performance of the liturgy, it's primarily in Hebrew. In certain para-liturgies, you will also get the Arabic and the Ladino mixed in. And then, of course, how the space itself constructs the sound. And finally, drilling down again more on aesthetics, the performance aesthetics that I'm going to look at here: vocal aesthetics, rhythmic aesthetics, melodic aesthetics, and some visual culture elements that all kind of come together for community members to contest the boundaries. So we'll talk a little bit here now about the ritual, and this is a heichal, or the aron, where the Torah is, the Torah scrolls are kept in the synagogue. Liturgy of processional liturgy, chazanut, which is the cantorial tradition, nusach, which is related to that and what is performed, and rituality, as mentioned before, the service flow, the ethos, the space, the time. This is inside this synagogue, Netivot Yisrael, and you can see the space itself is, again, what I was saying about the visual culture element. This particular synagogue was actually designed, and the mosaics carved, well, not mosaics, but the designs of the walls literally carved by artisans from Morocco, sponsored by the previous king of Morocco, Hassan II, who sent these artisans to help literally reconstruct a Moroccan space in Brooklyn. Also belies some associations, as I was saying before. The aesthetics: melodic aesthetic, rhythmic aesthetic, vocal aesthetic. This is a performance taking place in the synagogue of para-liturgical music. So let me talk a little bit about melody. I'll play a piece here first and foremost. This is, let me set this up before I talk about what's actually on this slide. On a research trip to Morocco, I had the fortune of spending some days in Chefchaouen, which is a small town in the north of Morocco. It's called the Blue City, a beautiful place. And I remember being woken up early in the morning by a muezzin chanting verses. And the way that the town is set up is, it's very hilly. So the room that I was staying in happened to be directly across from the minaret, and its microphone right across from the bedroom window. So this 4 o'clock wake up call was something that an ethnomusicologist immediately reaches for their tape recorder or mini disc recorder in those days, before even reaching for my glasses. And I thought to myself, you know, this soundscape is important part of what it means to be Moroccan. So this particular clip I'm going to play for you now is some of that recording that I made on that early morning, mixed with one of my informants performing some verses in Hebrew, just to show some of the melodic aesthetic connections.
يا من بيده مفاتيح الفرج فينا شر من يريد ضرنا من إنس وجان وباغ وحاسد وادفع عنا بيدك القوية يا قوي إنك على كل شيء قدير
Yoshi Hayamuna Elohim Imanu Kayashaya Imamu Jalmati Shoshi Hai Tamecha وفتنا حالتك ونسعد عجائب سعر والمشركما بيفوس بيخا سوسغي فانيخا هما لمهونا ليبا تغوزر في الشمسين وزغير بعض.
So just a little taste of that kind of a similar melodic contour and expression of text that we hear between these two performers. What I'm showing here on this slide is something called the emet tropes. And these are melodic figures that essentially form the nusach basis for mizmorim or tehillim on Shabbat, starting with Friday night, which follows the normal nusach of tehillim, and then Shabbat morning, which switches to a melodic trope that is associated with the reading of the text of Mishlei, Proverbs, and then finally, the after Baruch Shehemar in the middle of the service on Saturday mornings, switching to the melodic trope for Iyov, or the book of Job. So as it was explained to me by my informants, what we're seeing here is actually Tehillim, Mishlei, Iyov, which is Taf Mem Aleph, backwards, which is Emet, which means truth. And so this kind of investing within the melodic choices, this very idea of going through the services, the ritual of Shabbat, and making this truth come forward. So here is the Friday night Tehillim.
מזמור לדוד, הבו לאדוני בני אלים, הבו לאדוני כבוד ועוז, הבו לאדוני כבוד שמו, השתחוו לאדוני בהדרת קודש, כל אדוני על המים, אל הכבוד הרים, אדוני על מים רבים, כל אדוני בכוח, כל אדוני בהדר, כל אדוני שובר ארזים, וישבר אדוני את ארזי הלבנון, ויקידם כמו עגל, לבנון וסריון כמו בן רמים, כל אדוני חוצף להבות אש, כל אדוני יחיל מדבר, יחיל אדוני מדבר קדש, כל אדוני יחולל איילות, ויחשוף יערות, ובהיכלו כולו אומר כבוד, אדוני למבוא ישב, וישב אדוני מלך לעולם, Adonai oz le'amo yitzen, Adonai yivarech et amo b'shalom.
So this is applying that first trope. Now, just to share the intergenerational nature of this, this would be the third melodic figure that you see here.
Hallelujah, Adonai shir chadash, Tilato b'kahal chasidim, Yismach Yisrael be'osav, Bnei Tzion yagilu b'malkam, Yehallelu shemo b'malchol, B'tofech chino yezameru lo, Ki rotzeh Adonai be'amo, Yifa'el anavim be'yeshua, Ya'alezu chasidim, B'chavod yaranenu al mishkevotam.
Just to let a little bit in too about how this happens in the synagogue space is that for a lot of the youngsters that are attending schools in the neighborhood where they are far more exposed to non-Moroccan traditions, Syrian dominant traditions, which are Makam based, as well as Ashkenazi traditions. The synagogues based on Saturday morning, really, it's not just that the service is happening in the Moroccan approach with the chazanim and so forth, but the youngsters are literally being kind of coached downstairs on a weekly basis through all of the liturgy in order to really make sure that they understand and know the Moroccan sound, which they otherwise wouldn't be practicing the rest of the week. So it's important to community members to convey this. One last little taste would be the Shema, the Kriyat Torah, the recitation, the most important recitation passage to recite from the Torah. And this is similarly, in a Moroccan cantillation style. And this is the Baal Koreh from Nativot Yisrael. His job is specifically just reading or reciting Torah.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום אמרתך ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם ושבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ומשוכבך ובקומך ושאתה מלאות על ידיך, והיו רטות רבות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ומשעריך, והיה.
So I'm just going to pause that one there before we keep going beyond the Ve'ahavta. But this was clearly not recorded during services, as we can hear. First of all, I have a recording device, and secondly, we could hear a ding on a cell phone in the background. But the way that this would be performed would be much stronger, louder, and folks would be responding to some of those micro expressions, which we see in a lot of synagogues, where the making sure that the pronunciation is exactly accurate, that we see in a lot of synagogues. However, the melodies of the actual cantillation figures, motifs, are also corrected. So where we are common to hear in a synagogue the correcting of the actual pronunciation of the words, here you actually see correcting the melody as well, which I think is very interesting. So moving on to a little bit more of the liturgy and the rhythmic, the sense of rhythmic aesthetics, the 6/8 feel in Moroccan music, specifically the Sha'abi rhythm or rhythmic cycle, is very important for evoking that connection to the homeland. And so a simple song like this, which could be drawn from the classical or light classical traditions and used as a contrafactum for text in the liturgical setting, can also be imbued with this kind of 6/8 rhythmic cycle. And that can even be put in with songs that might not be drawn from the North African light classical traditions, where there's a clear melodic connection, but also rhythmic connection. But we could be taking a melody from a Yerushalmi melody or a melody even from the Ashkenaz repertoire and kind of investing it with a Moroccan rhythmic aesthetic. So this particular example that I'm about to play is taking a song that is from the light classical tradition. And I'll just play a little bit here on the oud to demonstrate. This is my oud. You won't see it so much here. Let's see. So,
על כל המעשים, ברוך ומבורך בפי כל הנשמה.
this is a very well-known piece, but then it switches about halfway through to this other melody.
מלאים זיו ומפיקים נוגה, נאה זיוום בכל העולם, שמחים בצאתם ששים בבואם, עושים בהמה רצון קוניהם.
So that's kind of doing a very straight. But the way to give it that Moroccan aesthetic on the rhythm is cycle. So we can hear my friend Chaim here.
מלאים זיו ומפיקים נוגה, נאה זיוום בכל העולם, שמחים בצאתם וששים בבואם, עושים בהמה רצון קוניהם. פאר וחבוד נותנים לשמו, צהולה ורינה לזכר מלכותו, קר על השמש ויזרח אור, רע והתקין צורת הלבנה. השבח נותנים לו כל צבא מרום, תפארת וגדולה. שרפים שרפים ואופנים ואופנים וחיות הקודש.
So in this particular case, like we would find in the synagogue, it's kind of easy for me to get that rhythmic vibe going, especially with an oud or a drum. But in this case, we can hear it happening just a cappella, just the vocals. And he is making the accenting in a way. Now, there's also can happen that one can bang on the teva, on the reading desk, to get a little bit of that rhythm going. But you hear the accenting mostly just happening right in the vocals. So that's a little example of the rhythmic aesthetic at work. Here's an interesting case too of the prayer from Morocco. So once again, making that homeland connection, Rabbi Bouskila has actually composed and performed a prayer in Hebrew and in Arabic for the Kingdom of Morocco. And on Yom Kippur, the most important holiday of the year, of course, the consular from New York, from Morocco, comes to the synagogue to receive a blessing. The consul comes to receive a blessing on behalf of the Kingdom of Morocco. Now, it happens to be that he also comes on some other occasions. One other occasion was a celebration of a community member, but also often the Hilulot, which are these celebrations of saints, tzaddikim, where there are instruments and kind of a very party atmosphere. So I'm going to share with you now this performance by Rabbi Bouskila.
One that we have here present with us, and I'm sure that we can extend our blessings to our dear friend Mr. the Consul, for him and his family, and that's why I would like to please ask everyone to rise. We're going to extend our blessings to His Majesty the King Sidi Mohammed Sadas. יהי שם אדוני מבורך מעתה ועד עולם, הנותן תשועה למלכים וממשלה לנסיכים, ומלכותו מלכות כל עולמים, הפוצע את דוד עבדו מחרב רעה, הנותן בים דרך ומים עזים נתיבה, הוא יברך וישמור וינצור ויעזור וירומם למעלה למעלה את אדוננו המלך סידי מוחמד סאדס ירום הודו, מלך מלכי המלכים, ברחמיו ישמרהו ויחייהו, ומכל צרה ונזק יצילהו, וייתן בליבו בלב כל יועציו רחמנות להיטיב עמנו ועם כל אחינו, בימיו ובימינו תבשע יהודה, ובא לציון גואל, וכן יהי רצון ונאמר אמן. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم يدا الجلال والإكرام، وهي من شمل ملكه أطراف السماء والأرض في أقسها، يا من يهب الملك بركة جلالة الملك سيد محمد السادس نصره الله، وأحفظ شخصه الجليل. اللهم أعنه ووفقه في مهامه الجليلة، وأنعم عليه موفور حكمتك لكيادة شعبه الوافي تحت ظله عدله. اللهم أرفع مكان جلالته وأعلي درجته في مسافي الأمم. اللهم أنعم عليه بموفور الصحة والعافية والطول العمر. اللهم بارك واحفظ الشعب المغربي، وانعم عليه من جزيل نعمك. آمين.
So moving on a little bit now to talk about a little bit of negotiation within or between Jewish communities, these sub-ethnic Sephardi Mizrahi communities, is some piece from the Yamim Noraim, Im Afes. And this particular piyut is quite well known throughout the entire region. First, I'm going to play a little bit of Moshe Habusha, who is a Yerushalmi performer in Israel, performing Im Afes, and then we can hear a bit of how it's done here in the Moroccan community, where again, the effort is to contest those boundaries and to make it Moroccan or Marocai in nature. And here's Rabbi Gad Buskila.
Im Afes Rovaken Ohel Shiken Imriken Alna
כי על כן יש לנו אבזן כן, פנים לא תכיר וצדקו לפניך נזכיר, כך נא בן יקיר ונמצא דמו על קיר. Now this is authentic Moroccan.
I love that little addition there, because for him, he's not even really aware that the melody is common in this other community, but for him it's authentically Moroccan. So that's the melodic provenance is not so important here. What's important though is the vocal aesthetic that's being applied. There's ways of vocalizing this, certain sorts of drops and slides in the way the melody is performed, as well as frankly a straightening out of some intervals because of the Moroccan context being less imbued with a makam or quarter tone kind of flavor. Next, I'm going to skip ahead here to Tisha B'Av. One of the other things about aesthetics is the performance aesthetics, what I call the interplay, which is very common in the Moroccan context, where the first type has individual congregants taking turns performing a line or two before passing the song on to another individual congregant to perform. And this is done in a very organic way throughout the community. I will say that if you can't cut it, then you get cut. It's sort of like a cutting session. Reminds me of the jazz jam sessions from the 40s, Michael. If you can't cut it on stage, you're going to get cut. So that's a little bit of how it happens. Another type of interplay is between the soloist, which would be often the chazan, and the congregation, a responsorial type singing, which is a form of interplay where the soloist prompts the group to respond. And we heard a little bit on that last example of that, and not unusual in liturgical context of several different faith communities. So let us take a listen to this this little taste of Levavi Maleh from the keynote of Tisha B'Av. Incidentally, Tisha B'Av is a really interesting occasion for experiencing Moroccan liturgical performance, because you can typically drive to the synagogue and record. And so a lot of people really come together in the synagogue that might not live so close. Folks that might be associating in other synagogues use Tisha B'Av as an opportunity to really come together around the Moroccan keynote, which happened to also be a quite expanded repertoire. Let's see. And I'm now going to turn our attention to really right up into the modern with what's up with WhatsApp. So, you know, talking about the constellation and the transnational connections. So in WhatsApp has become a very important part of the community's means for communication over the transnational landscape. And so there are several groups that have proliferated, including localized groups with individual synagogue community announcement boards, classes, friends, and so forth. International groups that could be focused on Moroccan music. I happen to belong to a few of these, and it's interesting because sometimes somebody might throw something in there that isn't Moroccan and they'll get chastised for it. There'll be, you know, several people will respond, this doesn't belong here. You know, if you want to have that other sound, that other música mizrahit or this other thing, you know, take it somewhere else. Intercommunal spaces really where for sharing Moroccan performance amongst other types of Jewish sub-ethnic performances. So then it's okay, well, here's the Moroccan, here's the Makam, here's this, that, and the other. And then performative groups. And this is a really interesting one because What's Up has facilitated the opportunity for kind of tutorial groups to emerge where individuals have many of them in an avocational way taken on passing on the tradition, posting something, and then asking others to respond with a short recording of their own right off the phone, and then giving some feedback to each other. And so this is a very interesting way that the community members in the trans nation are actually coalescing around musical expression, continuing to kind of contest these boundaries and perform these boundaries. So here is a little taste of an instrumental piece called a tushia, and this is performed by the ensemble that I direct, the New York Andalus Ensemble. This is Tushia Ijazm Saraki from a few years ago when we were still concertizing quite robustly. And following that will be a little taste of the way that the community, the Moroccan community, has actually taken a text written by the great Rabbi David Buzaglo, which is now set to this otherwise instrumental piece, put Hebrew text to it in a way that it could be then performed in contexts that don't have instruments. So this is another way of bringing things in. So here's a little taste of Tushia Ijazm Sarki. So that's just the instrumental overture, which is drawn from the classical tradition, Nala, which is very well-known piece. Here is what we hear passed around on What's Up.
אך בך מולדתי עמדתי, חייתה נפשי בגללך, מבית כלאים מול חיים, קורא לי דרור בנימך, מדור לשכני כרצוני, ליטל לי תחת צל צילך, תושב תוך הוא יצילך וכיסא כבוד ינחילך ירם בעולך בני.
So once again, really bringing a whole nother performance context for this song by giving it the Hebrew language setting. In conclusion, I would like to just reiterate that, you know, in Brooklyn, we're seeing that the Moroccans are at the forefront of really charting a new course in the Jewish historical experience and considering ways of understanding such a distinctive musical culture, we can confront the meaning of ethnicization, boundary contestation, generally, and of constructing diaspora identity or diaspora identities, in this case, more than one, more specifically. So essentially, you know, we're seeing the expressive culture at the forefront of how the community is navigating the contemporary moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. We're going to thank Sam in his absence here. He's going to be joining us in about 25 minutes for some Q&A. In the meantime, Vanessa, Paloma, Elbaz has very kindly agreed to offer a response to what we've just watched, this kind of rich mix of music and identity. Vanessa is right there. Are you ready to go, Vanessa?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi. So I have a small child behind the door here, so you might hear some things. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here and to respond to this. And actually, I wish that Sam was here because I have all sorts of comments and questions for him. But we correspond, so I'll ask him and mention it to him at some point. But I think that one of the things that really struck me and that I thought would be really interesting to discuss with this group was there are various things. There are the fact that his work is very almost completely male Jewish focused. And so the Moroccan voice that for me is missing here is the voice of Jewish Moroccan women and their repertoires, which I think would be interesting to incorporate into this broad landscape of Jewish soundscapes in diaspora. Or does it mean that in diaspora, the Jewish women have stopped singing Jewish materials in Brooklyn, which would also be interesting to hear about. In part, it might be because of kind of extended connections to the laws of Kolisha that in Morocco are not applied in that manner, in this similar way as the way that they're applied in Israel. But that in Morocco, the communities, and even in France, the communities that are very connected to Morocco are still more supple in the way that they interact with women's singing in mixed audiences. So that's one of the things that I think would be really interesting to hear more about. The other aspect that I was thinking about was, what is the relationship of this community to their own Americanness? Because we're hearing a lot about the relationship of this community to their Moroccanness in Brooklyn, in diaspora. But as we know, all communities in diaspora and Moroccan communities in diaspora, as I have a project on songbooks that traces very clearly how as they arrive to a new place, they absorb and they incorporate some of the local musics while keeping at the same time this ancestral or more localized music of this other geography of identity. So that I think would be really interesting to know which are the pieces of contrafacta, maybe of melodies, of American melodies that are coming into the Moroccan liturgy, if any at all. And maybe there are gradations. Maybe there are some congregations that are so completely hermetic in the way that they want to keep the transmission of this tradition, and maybe they haven't included any contrafacta. But as Jeffrey Summit's article, the Yankee Doodle Dandy, I always think about that one, that we know that American Jews, be they come from wherever they do, and whatever Nusach tradition they have, these melodies will be coming in at some point of the liturgical cycle during the year at some point. So if there is something that's coming in, it would be really interesting to know what that is, when that is, and what is the text that is allowed to play into this section of the American relationship. The other thing that I think, David, I'm on a Zoom right now. What happens? I'll help you in a little bit, okay? The other thing that I think would be really interesting is the relationship to Muslim Moroccans. So at the very end, he mentioned, he plays this piece, this Andalusian piece, the instrumental original version of what then is played on the WhatsApp. But do these Moroccan Jews in Brooklyn still have a relationship to the Muslim musicking, to the Muslim music making of this Andalusian repertoire that is used in the liturgy? Because these melodies have been passed on, they were taught very profoundly at Emabanim synagogue in Casablanca to generations of Paitanim that have gone out and then have gone out to Israel and then gone out to Canada, Montreal, Brooklyn, Los Angeles. And so that I think would be really interesting to know if this relationship that exists within Morocco has been able to continue in Brooklyn. In Paris, it continues somewhat. It does, the Jewish community in Paris, even though they've had such traumatic moments like the Bataclan and things like that, but there are moments of orchestral concerts that have Jewish paitanim, and where the orchestra is Muslim musicians that live in the periphery of Paris. And so I would be interested in knowing if the Brooklyn Moroccan descendant Jews continue this musical relationship with the local New York-based Muslim counterparts, musicians. That would be another interesting element about these corridors of the passing back and forth of repertoire, of manners of interpretation, because this is one of the things that as I experienced it as a chorister in Kinor David. So I'll kind of give some more, since we have plenty of time before Sam gets here, I'll give some more context. I was invited to integrate the Kinor David ensemble, which is the last Jewish Andalusian ensemble in Morocco, and it's all formed by paitanim. So it's all these. It's great to see everybody, by the way. Hi, Alex. Hi, Geraldine. Hi, Phil. And hi, Gordon. So, and everybody else that doesn't have their cameras up, hello as well. But so it was very interesting. So in 2013, I was invited to integrate Kinor David Maroc, which is a Judeo-Arabo-Andalusian group of paitanim, of liturgical singers, synagogue singers from Casablanca. Most of them are actually part of the Chevra Kadisha as well. They're all Shomer Shabbat, right? They're very observant. And I'm a woman. So first of all, here we go. I was very interested in the fact that they were okay with me integrating the group, and However, interesting talking about boundaries, there were, of course, boundaries about the way that these performances happened. So when we were performing in secular spaces, then I would perform with them. But of course, if there was ever, and there were a couple of times that the group performed for Shabbatot, so then I would not perform. I would be in the Ezrat Nashim, right? I would be upstairs sometimes. If it was in Casablanca, they traveled to Bordeaux, I think it was, to do a Shabbat presentation, and I did not sing with them, but there was this suppleness between this sacred and secular, right? This gendered use of the voice. However, our rehearsals were in synagogues, and when we were rehearsing, and when I started, so the very, very first rehearsal that I went to, we stayed in the synagogue nave, or in whatever we call that. And then I think somebody raised the question, and so we moved into a separate room for the next rehearsals. So we were no longer next to the Sefarim, next to the books of the Torah, because singing in a mixed group, even though it was choral, next to the Sefer was not considered to be acceptable. So I think that these for me, ethnographically and musically and religiously also, it was quite interesting to note and to experience, and to also experience the complete openness that these men who are shaliach tzibur, who are they're the leaders of their synagogues, and here I was singing this repertoire with them, and then we would invite Muslim musicians that would play with us, Moroccan, some of the experts of Andalusian music, and we would, of course, not rehearse next to the Sefarim, right? We would rehearse in the adjacent rooms, in part in respect to Jewish tradition, but also in part in respect to the Muslim musicians that might feel uncomfortable to be in a Jewish sacred space, right? That's so I think it's a very interesting kind of negotiation around boundaries and respect of the other in all the various directions that is being performed when they're living completely together, which is why I have the question of then what happens in Brooklyn when they're in a different political, geographic, and identity space, really, because they're all in diaspora. They're all minorities, really. Maybe some of the Jews might feel that they're less of a minority than the Muslims, right? And so that kind of shifts the power dynamic from the way that it operates in Morocco, and also the way that it operates in Paris, probably. And so these are questions that I think would be really interesting, actually, to discuss in relationship to the wider Moroccan diaspora. So the wider and because these diasporas are in conversation, they're in constant conversation with each other. These WhatsApp groups are across countries and languages, because sometimes if they're in Hebrew, then everybody can read them, and often they're in French, and a lot of these Moroccan descendants are francophone, right? Even if they were from the Spanish zone. So I think those are elements that I think will be really interesting to see if those of us that are studying Moroccan materials can develop across these boundaries of space. The other thing that I have a couple of notes here. The other thing that I've noted in the way that he was talking about the issue of diaspora and boundaries, and then we have the issue of Adama. So I've just recently actually written a chapter where the focus was Adama, and the whole idea of the relationship of the Jew through music to Adama, to the land, and how is that performed. And so it makes me wonder how in this very cosmopolitan city, within this very almost hermetic, observant Jewish community, where you can actually live within the Jewish community in Brooklyn and not necessarily so much interact with the wider world, except for very contingent elements. How are the Jews sonically then relating to the issue of their belonging to this land? So which land do they belong to? Are they through their singing of the Marokkai piyutim and the songs, especially, for example, on Tisha B'Av, which is so related to a land, right? And to a longing for a lost land, even though it's maybe not completely lost, but there's this issue of singing to reclaim the glory once past. Then how do these Jews in Brooklyn relate to this, and is their anxiety for the preservation of the piyutim in this way that he said this is 100% Moroccan, right? So what is that performing for these Moroccan Jews whose children, because we heard then the one of the children singing, I think it was Yov, have an American accent, right? So the Hebrew is with an American accent, and so it's no longer that other Hebrew that we hear that either has a French accent or further back that has an Arabic accent or a Spanish accent. So there are all these elements of accents and languages and layering, and then the varied outer sonic space that they're in constant negotiation with, because the synagogue is really a protected space, right? It's a protected sonic space. It's a protected space of ritual where these infrastructures of sound and of liturgical order, the Seder of the liturgy, is really there to perform a connection to locality, to tradition, and to the wider group of international Jewry, right? So I'm actually very, if you have not seen this book, oh, this is my blur is not working. Here we go. I should take off blur. It's called The Ritual Animal. Sorry about that. It's Harvey Whitehouse, and it's about imitation and cohesion in the evolution of social complexity. I highly recommend it. Anybody that works on ritual should be reading this. It just came out. He's at Oxford. He's an anthropologist at Oxford, and he looks at the way that ritual and that repetitive rituals and that complex repetitive rituals are actually the way that very complex social structuring has been able to be built and maintained over the centuries, and that groups that have even harder sets of rote learning are the ones that have the most hierarchical kinds of organizations. And it makes me think about the synagogue. So I think about it a lot as I'm reading this book. And I think that there's something that those of us that are working on Jewish repertoires would really, really benefit from looking at in this more anthropological and non-specific way of we're so focused in on the Jewish material that zooming out into this very human, this is the way that humans organize in social groups. And what does it take for social groups to stay cohesive throughout centuries? It's ritual is one of the major things, and hard ritual. according to White House, is key, because it creates, and so I actually sent him an email recently asking him if he had done any work on music, because it seems to me that music is a key part of ritual, that and he said he hasn't. So this is good for all of us, because this means that we have some work cut out in front of us. But these elements of how the contrafacta works, how that brings it in, and how that then brings in the outer culture into the inner core of ritual. How does the music of the other, be it maybe American, or be it Muslim, or maybe it's Ashkenazi, right? Any of these quote unquote others are then brought into this sacred inner core of ritual repetition, which then cements the connection to each other, right? And to a wider group. So this is what White House is saying, is that actually it's a way of organizing social groups so that we then become connected. When we have very, very large groups, we can become intrinsically connected to others that we have never even met, which is, of course, what we do in Judaism, right? So these are the kind of the wider traces of questions that I had about this. I'm very interested in. I was also very interested in seeing him show the blessing to the King of Morocco, right? Which happens on Yom Kippur in every Moroccan synagogue around the world, and it happens. There's one very specific one that it happens in Casablanca, which is Betel Synagogue, those of you that have been there, and the governor comes to receive the blessing kind of in name of the king and the government, and the Jewish community comes out, there. So the idea is that a large group of the Jewish community should be present to kind of have a showing in front of these representatives of the government. And then the photograph that Sam showed was from a very special tekes. How do you say tekes in English? This is a Hebrew word. It's my mind doing the multilingual thing. There was an event that happened. Let's just say the word event that happened in New York in, I think it was around 2015, something like that, and it was organized by Peter Geffen of Kivunim, and it was to celebrate Mohammed V and to celebrate him as the protector of the Jews during the Holocaust, and that he had actually said no to Vichy, and that he should be considered righteous unto the nations. And then they went and they did a presentation at the UN after, and the princess was, and there was also a prize that was given from the Jewish community of New York and from Kivunim to the royal family. And the princess came from Morocco specifically for this, as did André Azoulay. He was there, and there were some other notables from Morocco that flew in specially for this event. So this was a very performative event of the kind of the allegiance of diaspora Moroccan Jews to the royalty. This, something very similar actually, was just organized in Los Angeles last year by Omar Boum, the professor of anthropology, Muslim professor of anthropology, and I think David Suissa, who's the head of the Jewish Journal. So they organized this, and somebody from the royal family also came, and they brought Abdelrahim Sweety, a Moroccan Muslim singer of Andalusian music, a big star, to perform and sing. Interestingly enough, they brought Abderrahim Swiri, and they didn't bring Lior El Maliah or, somebody, a Jewish Moroccan star. So these are also questions that I think are interesting about allegiances and political allegiances of the way that Moroccan Jews kind of perform their political allegiance to the palace, to the regime, and in front of the world, right? As very staunch supporters of the Alawite dynasty, which, interestingly enough, I was just speaking with somebody about this recently. It's been since 1666. So this allegiance started with the rabbis in 1666 after the catastrophe of Shabtai Tzvi. And because in Morocco, that the Moroccan population was very taken up with the fervor, the messianic fervor of Shabtai Tzvi, and a lot of them sold their properties, and they were ready to go to the Holy Land and follow the Messiah. And then, of course, he converted to Islam. And so the rabbis were left with this disaster. And at the very same time, the Alawites took control of Fez, and they started their dynasty. So at that point, the rabbis and the palace forged a political connection. And so since then, I think this is very, very important to understand the relationship of Moroccan Jews until today to the palace, because it has been a steadfast since the inception of this dynasty, of the Alawite dynasty. And so it appears in these political liturgical moments of singing, of music, and maybe this is why it is Arabo-Andalusian music that is the most important within Jewish repertoires in Moroccan music, because it is the music of the powers that be, of the reigning power. So it's not Amazigh music. This is something that I've always questioned myself, like why are Jews from Morocco not pushing their Amazigh music, right? Their Berber music or the Judeo-Spanish music as much, but it's always when they're on the public sphere and in the liturgy and in Israel, all the Piyut conference, the whole thing, it's Allah, it's Arabo-Andalusian music, but it's this deep connection to the Alawite dynasty and the power structure that has been so important for Moroccan Jews, because it has really been a buffer between them and any kind of tribal attacks that always happen. But then what happened also was that often when people wanted to attack the monarchy, they would attack the Jews, because attacking the Jews attacked the monarchy. So this is it's an interesting play that we see very often play out in music, but that's very deeply interconnected with the politics of Morocco, even until today, as we see with, the Abraham Accords and the way that came across, that was kind of with Israel in the middle and the Western Sahara and America. And it was a whole interweaving of politics, of what Morocco wanted, which was that the US would accept the Western Sahara, and the way to get it was with this Abraham Accord with Israel. So just to, and the last thing that I'll say to that is that I was just in Casablanca last week, actually, and there was a concert last Monday of a Jewish and a Muslim singer. They did not sing any Arabo-Andalusian music. No liturgical music, and I went backstage to speak to the singer, the Jewish singer Coco Torjman first, and I asked him, so what's the repertoire? And he said, I don't want any anana, anana. He said, that is so boring. I just can't deal with it anymore. I want to sing Portuguese and Algerian music and popular music. And they even sang Havanagila. So, but there were there were many ambassadors. It was a completely political concert. And at the end, they sang a song for the Western Sahara. So these are kind of the dynamics that are happening in Morocco, and that when foreign Moroccan musicians come to Morocco, so let's say Brooklynites or from Canada or from Los Angeles or from Jerusalem, they come, then the Moroccans will always sing Masir al-Khadra, the song of the Green March. So here, it would be interesting to know then what is the relationship of these Jews in Brooklyn to what has happened recently, and what about the Jews in Los Angeles and the Jews in Montreal, which are very, very connected to Morocco, the ones in Paris and the ones in Israel. I mean, I would say, instead of just saying Jerusalem, but because these things play out musically, and then they ripple into the liturgy as well. So maybe there is soon a contrafacta with Masir al-Khadra, right, with a song that's about the Green March. We have had the Masir al-Khadra sung at Hilulot, at pilgrimages for holy rabbis on top of the tomb of the rabbi. So, and there was a WhatsApp message that went viral along in the Muslim circles. They were thrilled to see these Orthodox Jews singing this song about the Sahara. So these relationships, that's why I think it's so interesting to cast the net very wide, to look into what is happening inside of in the liturgy, in the synagogue, in these diasporic spaces. But then how does this then ripple out into the political sphere, into the other diasporic cities of Moroccan Jews? Does it have, is it different according to proximity? Maybe according to linguistic proximity, or according, here's Sam, according to familial proximity. Do these elements then shift? Do they change? And these are all questions that I think we have some years to follow, to continue, and to uncover, hopefully, and be able to really find a deeper truth together. So this is why I'm so grateful for these kinds of conversations where we can, thank you very much, where we can do all these things together. I just was given a slinky that has just been fixed. I'm very sorry. So, hey, Sam.
Hello
Vanessa,
there.
Hi, Sam. Vanessa, I think that slinky is it's just a small reward for a tour de force response there. Thank you very much. That was really a terrific discourse on a great talk from Sam. Thank you both very much. I wonder, just at the risk of trying you just a tiny bit further, Vanessa, could you have one of those questions that you want to put to Sam? I mean, my one would be for the gender one that you started with, but whatever you're kind of maybe most itching to ask him, if Sam is happy to take that. Hi,
I'm
Sam.
just trying to find a good location for this camera. 1 second.
Hey, Sam.
Okay, I'm going to do this. Go ahead, Vanessa. I'm listening.
Don't worry.
I just want you to know that I was also braving the tube strike today in London. Oh, wow, that was crazy. So, okay. So my question, Sam, thank you so much for that talk. I will probably watch it again at some point. But for me, I work on women's music, and one of the things that was glaringly absent was any mention or even view of women. And so I'm interested in knowing if there is, if in diaspora then the Jewish women from Morocco have stopped singing their Moroccan songs? Has that been silenced because of a certain kind of orthodoxy that is not practiced in the same way in Morocco? Because in Morocco there are elements that are allowed. The other question that I'm just going to throw quickly at you is, what is their relationship to all the other Moroccan diasporas, right? As in Canada, Los Angeles, Paris, and Jerusalem, let's say. And what is their relationship to their Americanness and to Muslim musicians in Brooklyn or in the New York area? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Sure. So let me just say that first and foremost, to deal with the issue of women, I mean, I cannot emphasize enough that so much of my work goes way beyond the sphere of what this particular study or this particular community that I presented is. And in this particular setting, of course, we are talking about a very male-dominated sphere, liturgical practice for the most part, and even, I guess, by stretch, performance in the Hilula or the life cycle events in this particular community. So I do think that I often point people to your work on the integration of songs from the women's sphere in liturgical practice in Morocco itself. I think here, because we're talking about a diaspora community or a community in the diaspora where there is this inclination towards some preservation of homeland, there is not a whole lot of space for the same kind of musical expression coming in from the grassroots, if you will, particularly from the women's sphere, because there's also so many other influences of Jewish life coming in from the Syrians and from the Ashkenaz, and so there's plenty of things to kind of be on the lookout for, if you will, for new expressions. And there is this sense, and I think you hit the nail on the head, where the Orthodox trends have affected this particular community 100%. I mean, we are talking about the experience of these Moroccan Jews. For sure, the leadership are, for the most part, being trained in Lakewood, New Jersey, which is a very big center of what we might term black hat Orthodox Jewish life. Not that, and it's interesting because there's still kind of, I would say, a lot of folks in the community, but even in the leadership, that do push back a little bit and mitigate a little bit of that based on the very roots of their Moroccanness. So it's one of the negotiation points, right? And a big part of my talk is foregrounding this notion of negotiating the boundaries, if you will, performing the boundaries. And so it's kind of in constant process. And so I do think that in this diasporic community, there is definitely a kind of incorporation of some of the trends in Orthodoxy that has been even more proscriptive of women's contributions in the ritual sphere, in the public sphere. At the same time, there is this sub-ethnic mitigation going on in terms of what kinds of things can come in. Now, with that said, I will say that the things that are in modern Sephardic thought, if you will, which is obviously also very much influenced by Ashkenazi thinking in yeshivot, Ovadia Yosef, who's the big posek for the Sephardic community in the modern period, made it very clear in one of his halachic decisions that women on recordings were mutar, are allowed. And therefore, the performances of women in a recorded format are drawn from on occasion, particularly for contrafacta. So one thing that comes to mind is like Sarit Haddad, well-known Israeli Muzika Mizrachit, popular singer in recent decades. And so she produced a version of the song Ismah Hatami, right? I'm getting the title of it wrong, but in any case, the well-known wedding song that has become a song that worked its way in, not terribly unlike what you described in northern Morocco, but it's just far less grassroots. That's like kind of a very produced pop song that made it on the airwaves and then kind of is adopted and adapted in that kind of way. So I think that we are talking about, in some respects, a more protracted place for women in this sphere. And that isn't that women don't sing, but women following the kind of modern standards of Orthodox thinking in this community, will sing, but they're singing from the women's section. And they're certainly not going to be in any sort of public leadership singing roles in this community. So, yeah, I think that's where the kind of missing voice of women is clearly actually missing. And no apologies really to the study, because it really is about a lot of the way that the performance of liturgy is dealing with sub-ethnic boundaries. And that is a male-dominated sphere. To your second question, the relationship to, and by the way, I should mention, right, like there are plenty of other female expression in the Moroccan diaspora. So I again want to say, just to reiterate, this is about this particular community and this particular study, as opposed to me kind of elaborating on this writ large, because I'm obviously clearly aware of plenty of female expressions in the world of Moroccan Jewry that go beyond this study. To the second point about relationship to other diaspora sites and to other elements of the diasporic community, and I think particularly that which is not Jewish, which is interesting. There is definitely a connection, but if we're going to talk musically, there is, as I mentioned toward the tail end of my talk there, certainly new circuits of communication, like with WhatsApp groups and training groups and YouTube. So there's definitely connecting to expressions by Moroccan Jews in these other places, be it Israel or LA or France or Canada. But there is, I think, a lot of, and maybe this is part of the trend of Orthodoxy too, of trying to kind of canonize, right? What is Moroccan Jewish liturgy, or Moroccan, what's the standards, what are going to make it into the Moroccan Jewish real book, so to speak, right? I find this as a performer a lot, that there are clearly performance choices that I make in certain concertized experiences that I know I am highlighting something that is outside the standard Moroccan real book. And then I know there are times when I'm highlighting things, or certain occasions that I might be performing a wedding or a henna or something like that, where I better be pulling from that standards book, right? I mean, can you imagine a henna without doing dorbeha? Even though I would never want to do dorbeha in concert, because actually I'm much more aware of the meaning of the song than probably most people are really thinking about when they want to hear it at a henna. But that's performing the boundary. And so there is something to say about not only the impact of diaspora is what I'm getting at, I think, in the study, the complex of diaspora and how that influences those choices, but also modern Orthodox trends, which I don't mean modern Orthodox, modern trends in Orthodoxy that, are definitely interested in canonizing, I mean, we see that in rabbinic thought, and we see it in musical practices. So I think we see it in a lot of different realms of expressive culture. So they are connecting to other diasporic sites, but in a very strategic way, I would say, in ways that sort of help to reinforce the standard building, if you will, like, so that, now when you go into a Moroccan synagogue in LA, or in Brooklyn or in Ashdod, you've got a sense of like what you're going to hear. And, this is just, and very well as I do, like a lot of this is related to the breakdown of the regional identities of Moroccan Jewry that would have existed, more robustly a century ago. Starts really with the trends towards the migrations towards Casablanca and then beyond, that I think kind of develops this Moroccan identity that seems to supersede now a Meknesi or a Marrakchi or a Tanger type of identity. So,
Thank you.
Sam.
Yeah.
Do you want to come back on that, Vanessa, or should we see if someone else has a...
I would say I've spoken enough, and I'm sure that other people have other things that they would like to ask. Sam, we have to have a chat and talk and discuss, because there's a lot of stuff that I think would be really interesting to kind of talk about more. So if we have more time, I'll bring it up. But if not, I would say open the floor.
Do we have someone else who'd like to ask a question or comment? Or Rachel. Thought we might hear from Rachel. Hi.
Hello.
Hey, Rachel.
Hey. This was fascinating. I love the way that you present, and it's just always fun to listen to you, even through several different layers of recording. While you were talking about this whole sort of thing about making and reinforcing boundaries, and I'm thinking about Morocco, which is a country that has some interesting issues with boundaries in general. And then you talked about sort of these local regional identities that are all sort of becoming generically Moroccan. And I was wondering, how do Moroccan Jewish communities, I suppose the ones in New York best, but how in general might Moroccan Jewish communities specifically form boundaries of Moroccanness with their nearest neighbors? Like, I'm thinking about Algerian communities, like where do the borders there, how do those get? How do you say I'm Moroccan and not Algerian?
Yeah, I actually
correspond to modern boundaries.
Yeah, I won't say entirely unforeseen consequence of my work that I'm presenting here today, but one that definitely developed, a consequence that developed in my research was that, I was really in a neighborhood doing work that has many different Sephardic groups rubbing elbows with one another. And a particular dynamic that's a bit different than I think a lot of other centers that we kind of think of as diasporic Moroccan Jewish life centers is that in Brooklyn, the dominant Sephardic Middle Eastern community is Syrian and has, quite a embedded and evolved and developed institutional presence in the neighborhood. And also, unlike the other sites of Moroccan Jewish life around the world that we kind of think of, where Moroccans are the predominant Sephardi Mizrahi group, this is a case where they are not, and they are decidedly the minority. in the neighborhood. And so that creates an interesting dynamic because, they're in some respects, the diaspora or the constellation, if you will, that has been able to be fostered and connected with in the modern period in a way that would not have existed in the same fashion 100 years ago with, travel and technologies of communication, have in a lot of ways allowed the Moroccan community in Brooklyn to reproduce and perpetuate this Moroccan borders, even within this major influence of neighbors, as you point out, that are clearly not Moroccan. But with that said, there's also so much that happens in an analog way in such a community, especially around liturgical practice, that there's a lot of porousness to the boundaries. And when I think about it on a very musical, practical level, hearing a bayat makam, on the lips of a Moroccan Chazan is not unusual that they could perform that. And in some ways they become bi-musical, tri-musical, they can, easily, the rabbi Chazan of this particular synagogue, it could be 100% Moroccan sounding, and then all of a sudden he flips a switch and you hear a Chabad melody. And he even changes the way that he is producing vocal style to sound much more Ashkenaz. So because that's also part of the community, right? I don't want to just in the other Sephardic groups, but Ashkenazi groups too. So it's somewhat of a particular consequence of the Brooklyn scene. It also has to do with again, as I mentioned before, where a lot of the leadership in the community have been trained and what exposures they've had. And even the kids, the kids themselves in the community are those that attend yeshivot in the neighborhood are attending yeshivot that are predominantly Syrian in terms of their background, or Yerushalmi, you might say, Israeli Sephardim that have moved into the neighborhood that are essentially Levantine or, Makam oriented, because we're really talking about the musical consequences here. So I think that, just getting back to the question itself, I think that they're very much having to consistently and perpetually negotiate these boundaries. I, again, as a consequence, a somewhat unforeseen consequence, was I found myself having to really circulate through many other Sephardic synagogues in the neighborhood to perceive what the experience was for Moroccans in Brooklyn, even beyond the Moroccan synagogues, the ones that were really sub-ethnically Moroccan, so that I could see, well, what's the experience? Because there are Moroccans that are in these other shoals. Mm-hmm. And so they are picking up these other melodies in these other music ways.
Thank you. And just as a consequence of being in Brooklyn, have you learned how to say forget about it in Arabic?
Yeah. And there's a sign on the highway that reminds you anytime you're headed to JFK. So all spelled out.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah. But, it is some, and I do think those boundaries, like, obviously we're talking about music here, but one of the interesting things is, music is language. You can hear the languages of the community, and it's very much, a unique mix of English, Hebrew, French, a little bit of Arabic from Morocco, right? And that particular accent of Arabic, that dialect. And so, you're hearing this swirling around a kiddush. And, there's something to say for that too, that there's just that kind of complex of languages in the air, which distinguishes that, these Moroccan synagogues from if you walk into a Syrian synagogue, for instance, or into an Ashkenaz synagogue, just down the road.
And just out of curiosity, since we might actually be able to start going places soon, roughly what roads are you talking about? If I wanted to sort of get a sense of the neighborhood, can you?
So the neighborhood is centered around kind of like Gravesend, Kings Highway. So it's in southern Brooklyn, down Ocean Parkway to Kings Highway. That's kind of like the main epicenter, I guess you could say. And from there, it extends east and west and a bit north and south. But, you know, the further north you go into Midwood, then you start to get into the Ashkenaz yeshivish neighborhood. And there is a lot of crossover there. I mean, there's a major Syrian synagogue, Bet Torah, which is on Avenue I. So that's a little further up. That would otherwise be kind of considered Ashkenaz central in terms of the neighborhood. But, you know, there are a couple Hasidic shtibels in the very same Sephardic neighborhood. So there, you know, there are these kind of crossovers. There's several Chabads, of course, everywhere. One of the interesting things too, which I didn't really get into in this study, is the Moroccan synagogue in Crown Heights, which is in the heart of the Chabad world, where you would see people come in off the street to go to shul, and they look absolutely like Chabadniks. But then once they open their mouth to actually sing the liturgy, it's really one of the only shuls whole Crown Heights neighborhood where the liturgy is absolutely expressed differently than the typical Chabad liturgy. And so all of a sudden the music operates as a real stark boundary builder in an area that is otherwise monolithically Chabad.
Cool. Well, as soon as we can go places again, I want to go there.
We'll get together for some kanafe.
Anyone else want to come in here? Charles, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, hello, everybody. So that was fascinating. So I have a question for Sam about a reference. It sounded very interesting talking about ritual. And all I want to know is, on one of his slides, he referred to Torino 2004, and he refers to time and space. So those of us who beaver away trying to work on the whole question of Nusach, we come back to celebrating time and space. So what I want to know is if he can just tell me this reference to Turino 2004.
The actual reference, I'll have to look up here for 1 second. Let's see. I mean, it's from his book, Music in Social Life. Okay. So I mentioned page 7 in that particular book, but he really is talking about space, ritual and space. I am adding time because I believe I'm talking about, you know, liturgical practice is kind of and of course music being as much about organizing time as it is about characterizing the space. So we might think of the space in terms of the sounds we produce reverberating off the walls, but I also think very much about music as, you know, a controlling of time, right? I mean, it is an organization of time. We experience it, and then a certain amount of time has elapsed during that experience. And I think furthermore that, you know, when we couple that with ritual, which is what liturgy is really there to facilitate, then we are talking about something that's very much organizing time and expressed in time. So, you know, we're kind of, I think in this particular community that I'm presenting today, you know, we're definitely talking about a way of constructing the soundscape, but very much a way of constructing the time experience, that this is Moroccan time, right? Now we are on Moroccan time.
Right. That's what it's all about. Okay, Shkoch, thank you very much. Chazak u'baruch, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to draw it to a close because I think we are almost out of time. That last comment, Sam, strikes me very interesting. We have lots of ways of articulating the soundscape, don't we? And we talk about music and place a lot, and we don't actually even have the terminology for the sound time or whatever we would call that. And you're right. There's music as an articulation of a particular period of time, the time that music takes to unfold and say whatever it's going to say. But then there's also music about making connections through time, which is of course what ritual music is often about. And it just strikes me as you're talking, there's a real gap in terminology there. I think the musicological terminology there is lots of musicological terminology to talk about duration in that sense, in formal terms, but we don't have that much more kind of cultural thing. So maybe there's another task for us, along with Vanessa's suggestion that we all get stuck into how we organize ritual and, in a sense, belong through music. And as a final thing, Vanessa, could you just remind us of your reference there, the book that you're currently reading?
Yes, it's called The Ritual Animal by Harvey Whitehouse, Oxford University Press, and I think it's 2022. Let me just see. But it's 2021. It just came out November, I think.
Thank you. All right, with 2 minutes to the end, I'm going to wrap it up. That was really fascinating. It deserved a much larger audience. A lot of our regulars, for some reason, did not make it today, they really missed out. And I will encourage them to check out the recording, because that was really very masterful stuff. Thank you very much indeed, Sam and Gordon and Vanessa for organizing all of that, and Sam and Vanessa for your fantastic contributions. Next week we have Marsha Dubrow in conversation with composer Judith Shatin, so that's going to be good too. Look forward to seeing you all then, or some of you anyway. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me. It was great to share.
Thanks a lot, guys. See you.